I'm Mark Florman. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker in a moment, but first I'd just like to acknowledge a man in the audience, Greg Clark, Member of Parliament for Tunbridge Wells. I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Andrew Mitchell, MP, the Secretary of State for International Development, has transformed this country's approach to global poverty and to our thinking around international development. Could you please welcome everyone, Andrew Mitchell, Member of Parliament.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice for me to be back in the city and looking at the list of people who are here tonight. I see practically every firm I used to work with when I was at Lazard, where I was, in fact, for more than 25 years. Let me start by just saying a word or two in this erudite audience about the way in which we are trying to change international development. And then I'll come very directly to why I support this charity so strongly in the work that it is doing, and why I hope that you too will give this charity your support. And if you're already supporting, thank you very much. You're doing a great job. There are four ways, above all, in which we're trying to change the work of international development. The first is that Britain is an international development world leader, a superpower, if you like, on international development. But the Department for International Development has too often in the past resembled a rather well-upholstered NGO moored off the coast of Her Majesty's government. And we are trying to turn it into a Department of State for Development in the developing world, which works much more closely across Whitehall on poverty alleviation, and trying to ensure that British aid and British development is properly badged. I'll have more to say publicly about this next week, so that the hard-pressed British taxpayer who is supporting these policies gets the credit around the world for the brilliant work that is being done in their name, is a very important part of what we are doing. The second way in which we are changing development is that too much in the past has been focused on the inputs that we make rather than the outputs and outcomes. And we think that people in Britain want to see how many teachers you train, how many schools you build, the outputs of this work, or even more important, the outcomes of how many children get a quality education. And the focus on results, ensuring that people can see for every hard-earned pound that we spend, that they're really getting 100 pence of delivery on the ground in terms of those results, is incredibly important. And what Britain is doing over the 5 years of this Parliament in educating 9 million primary school children around the world, 2 million secondary school children, at 2.5% of the cost of educating a British child, vaccinating children in the poor world every 2 seconds, and saving the life of a child every 2 minutes from diseases that none of our children die from. And these are not exotic diseases. This is diarrhea, pneumonia, measles. Something which Britain can, in my view, be really proud of. And thirdly, another highly visible area, matching every single citizen in Britain to someone in the poor world who does not have access to clean water and sanitation today, but during the course of this Parliament will get it. 60 million people. These are fabulous results which people can be really proud of in our country, in which we are now focusing on delivering. And for the first time ever, too, we have the metrics to be able to follow and explain the results we are achieving, to justify them and make clear what they are. The third area which we have changed is to focus very much on conflict. Conflict is one of the key delineators of poverty, but it is also an area of threat to the United Kingdom. If you take a country like Somalia, in which has more British passport holders training to do us ill than any other country in the world, tackling the causes of this dysfunctionality through the development budget, trying to make sure that we tackle the causes upstream when we have the ability to change these situations rather than have to send in the troops to deal with the symptoms, as we have had to do, for example, in Afghanistan. This is a very important change in British development policy. And our security here in London and elsewhere in Britain is not just secured by our brilliant armed services. It is also secured by training the police in Afghanistan, building up governance structures in the Middle East, and getting girls into school in the Horn of Africa. These things also make us safer, and it is the development budget which pursues this. This is not just aid from Britain, it is aid for Britain. It makes us more secure and more stable here. And the final area, which I hope particularly will appeal to this audience, is that we have put at the front and centre of our development policies the work of the private sector. All of us in here know that it is the private sector, wealth creation, economic growth, enterprise. A country which cherishes its entrepreneurs will not remain poor for long. These are the things which help drive development and help poor people to lift themselves out of poverty. We have completely reformed CDC, the old Commonwealth Development Corporation, to honour this principle. Even the last Labour government was beginning to get this point about the private sector being the engine of development and not the enemy. We are very clear, and we have put the work of the private sector absolutely at the centre of everything we are doing. So that is the changes that we have made. We argue, even in these very difficult economic times in Britain, we should not turn our backs and balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in Britain or in the world. And I am personally proud to be a member of a government that has made that decision. For under 1% of our national income, we are able to do the right thing, which our generations can, to do something about these colossal discrepancies of wealth and opportunity which exist in our world today, and which our generations for the first time are able to do, as well as doing something which helps build our own future prosperity, stability and security, as well as for those we are trying to help. Now I turn secondly to this brilliant charity, Build Africa. I want to explain that educating children in the poorest parts of the world, we've been quite successful at this in recent years, but there are still some 57 million children who do not go to school because they do not have a school to go to. And it is part of this government's commitment to try very hard to get more children into school, particularly in the places where Build Africa is working. We have set up last year a Girls' Education Challenge Fund, which is designed to get up to 1 million girls into school in some of the most difficult parts of the world, using the power of the private sector, the voluntary sector, philanthropic charities and foundations and so forth. I am, of course, delighted that Build Africa has been able to benefit from the government's Global Poverty Action Fund, and UK Aid has been able to support Build Africa's programme with a grant of £340,000 to increase retention and completion at 40 Ugandan schools, reaching 14,000 children. I think that is a tremendous success for Build Africa and a very good deal for the taxpayer. The Global Poverty Action Fund is the way in which Britain now supports some of these brilliant NGOs and charities who are doing this great work in the poorest parts of the world. And it operates on this principle. If you are a charity, you should raise your own money from your own supporters. But if a charity working in development comes to the government and says, we are raising £1 million and we are achieving X, and if the taxpayer, by adding £1 million, can more than double the X, that's an incredible deal for the taxpayer and is a sort of 2-for-1 deal for us and a 2-for-1 deal for the charity. I think it's known as bog-off in the trade. Buy one, get one free, and that is what the effect of this Global Poverty Action Fund is, and I very much hope that it will contribute further to driving the aims and aspirations of Build Africa to continue the brilliant work that it is doing in getting children into school. So let me bring my remarks to a close. The private sector, the role of the private sector, which has had an enormous effect on development, not least because it brings standards to secure results and of accountability and transparency into development, which haven't always been there. Engaging with the private sector, as well as with charities like this to drive forward these aims, is enormously important to the government, and it is an absolute pleasure for me tonight to support such a well-run, cutting-edge charity which is doing so much good. And I very much hope that all of you will give it your support as well. Thank you very much.